The title of my talk this morning is All Behavior Makes Sense. And I want to start with this somewhat provocative statement that all behavior makes sense, even harmful, unskillful behavior. And I was motivated to talk about this because I recently heard another teacher say that their definition of enlightenment was seeing the world through the lens that all behavior makes sense. And from a Buddhist perspective, this statement can be understood through the lens of several fundamental teachings that we'll talk about this morning. And those are dependent origination, the law of karma, and the nature of mind. And they illuminate the causes and conditions that, at least in the Buddhist world, lead to all human behavior. They tell us that every action, no matter how perplexing, no matter how harmful it may seem, arises from specific circumstances, mental states, and perceptions. Now, this perspective in no way condones harmful actions, but it provides a framework for understanding and for responding with compassion more than judgment or condemnation. Buddhism teaches us that nothing happens or exists independently. All phenomena, including human behavior, arises due to causes and conditions. And we talk about that often, but I want to really hone in on it this morning. So let's start with this notion of dependent origination. It's a complicated concept, and I'll do my best to break it down. I've struggled with it over the years. But this is the concept that the Buddha taught that explains that thoughts, emotions, and actions are the result of this vast web of interconnected factors. For example, our upbringing, our social environment, our mental habits, our past choices, everything that we encounter is this part of this complicated web of interconnected factors which produce who we are, produce our behavior, our choices, our preferences, our harmful, our skillful behaviors, and so on. And so when viewed through this lens, behavior that might initially seem to us irrational, even incomprehensible, could be understood as the natural occurrence of these conditions. So let's just take a simple example. Someone lashes out in anger. And from a simple or a superficial social perspective, their behavior might seem unreasonable. But if we delve deeper, we might discover that they were conditioned by past experiences of neglect, of trauma, of growing up in an angry environment, or they are currently overwhelmed by stress and fear. In other words, things don't just happen for no reason, is what the Buddha would suggest. But it does not mean that we tolerate the behavior again or that we not hold the person accountable. It only means that we see that their behavior makes sense when we understand the multitude of factors that have led to it: personal, social, cultural, biological. The list goes on and on. And again, it does not mean that their actions are acceptable. Rather, it means that they are comprehensible when viewed through this causal framework of dependent origination. Secondly is the notion of karma, central teaching in Buddhism, which further explains that all behavior makes sense. Today, mostly we talk about karma in terms of the ethical law of cause and effect, where intentional actions create corresponding results. The teaching from the Bible, as ye sow, so shall ye reap, really reflects this notion of karma. Our habits, our choices, our tendencies are shaped by our past actions. What the Buddha called imprints on the mind. And over time, these imprints influence how we think, we feel, and we act. So if I behave in certain ways, especially unskillful or harmful ways, the notion is sooner or later, these are going to catch up with me. For example, a person who habitually succumbs to greed, who has cultivated this tendency through repeated actions, they act selfishly, but their behavior becomes understandable in light of their karmic conditioning. And they may down the road have to account for that greedy behavior. And again, not an excuse for unethical behavior, but for understanding it. recognizing the deeply ingrained patterns that drive all human actions. By understanding karma in this way, we realize that behavior is not random or arbitrary, but the results of accumulated causes. Now, historically, karma had to do with rebirth and future births in different lifetimes and so forth. But I think these days we think of it more in terms of cause and effect. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. Buddhism identifies ignorance as one of the three poisons as another root cause of suffering and suffering and unskilled behavior. It refers to the fundamental understanding of reality, particularly the mistaken belief in a permanent, independent, separate self. And this belief then can give rise to craving, to aversion, the other two poisons, which in turn lead to unwholesome actions. So when we see someone acting out, or ourselves for that matter, acting out of one of the three poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion, we understand that their behavior reflects their inner struggle with ignorance, with the inability to perceive reality clearly. And ideally, this helps us respond with understanding and compassion, not judgment. From a Buddhist perspective, this is not a moral failing, but rather a condition of being caught in a cycle of suffering. This notion of a cycle of suffering in general talks about this painful responses perpetuated by ignorance, by not seeing things as they are. And it helps us, and seeing things this way helps us foster compassion. When we see that unskillful behavior arises from suffering and confusion, just as our own skillful actions do. One of the central tenets that we talk about here often is cultivating compassion. When we understand that all behavior arises from causes and conditions, dependent origination, ignorance, karma, we are less likely to react with anger or judgment. Instead, we seek to develop empathy for the struggles that lead others to act as they do. And this opens the door to respond similarly to our own struggles, rather than self-condemnation and self-judgment. We are more inclined to look at our own negative patterns once we begin to broaden this perspective and create some spaciousness, rather than trying to hide our negative patterns, our unskillful patterns, from ourselves and others. So at the risk of beating the same drum, let me say again that compassionate perspective does not mean condoning harmful actions, including our own. It doesn't mean we and others are not accountable for our harmful actions. It just means we understand them as not just the fact that someone's bad or mean or evil or whatever. It means that recognizing that such actions arise from suffering and ignorance. When someone behaves aggressively, instead of just saying, oh, they're a bad person or they're a terrible person, we can try to reflect on the pain or confusion that might be driving their actions. And what this does is it lessens our tendency toward othering. It lessens our tendency toward separation that comes from our judging minds. And this shift in perspective helps us respond more skillfully, with patience and kindness, rather than just escalating the conflict or othering the person. And this way, understanding that all behavior makes sense becomes a tool for fostering greater peace and harmony in our lives and in our relationships. So now for some good news. Having said all that, while all behavior makes sense in light of causes and conditions, Buddhism teaches that none of us are bound by our past. None of us are bound by these causes and conditions. And the Buddha laid out a path through mindfulness, ethical conduct, and meditation where we can transform, once we can see them clearly, transform unwholesome patterns of behavior, cultivate wisdom and compassion. And the Eightfold Path is the practical framework for this transformation, because it guides us towards actions rooted in clarity and virtue, rather than ignorance and delusion. So as provocative as the statement, all behavior makes sense, may initially seem, it's not so radical when we view it through a Buddhist lens. Instead, ideally, it inspires us to take responsibility for our own behavior and to support others in their journey toward greater understanding and freedom in their lives. By addressing the root causes of suffering, ignorance, craving, aversion, the three poisons, we can break free from the cycles of unskillful behavior and create conditions for peace and awakening. From a Buddhist perspective, all behavior makes sense because it arises from specific causes and conditions shaped by the things that we talked about, karma, influenced by the nature of the mind. And this understanding encourages us to look beyond surface level judgment, reflexive, reactive judgments, and perhaps see and approach others with empathy and compassion. When I can come from this place, when I can find this perspective, it really helps me rein in my harsh judging mind. Most of us just have this harsh reflexive reaction to unskillful or harmful behavior. While we may not and probably do not agree or condone such harmful actions, we recognize the suffering and ignorance that gives rise to them. And in doing this, we create conditions for healing. We create conditions for transformation, both within ourselves and in those around us. By embracing this more compassionate understanding, we align ourselves with the Buddhist teachings on the path of wisdom, kindness, and liberation. So that is all behavior makes sense.